this, Ezra, but even just, talking to people who were involved in it journalistically, you hear them. And it was this idea that Donald Trump he's not a man of the conservative movement. He doesn't come in with the infrastructure. That was part of the reason that conservatives pushed him to pick Mike Pence, because Mike Pence, as VP, knew all of the heads of the conservative movement groups where you would tap personnel and staff from, where you would tap the white papers from. He kind of knew where to look to get people and policies. And because Trump's orbit hadn't become, substantially more cohesive or policy-centric, people really started to say, all right, we need something like a Project 2025. This ultimately became Project 2025 because this isn't organized. And that's why Project 2025 and Heritage also have something called, I think it's called like the 100-day agenda that hasn't been made public yet. It's internal. I've never seen it. But it's the executive orders that should be ready to go on day one. It was this idea that there's just nothing, like we're having all of these debates, but we're not putting any of it into sort of a hard agenda. A lot of Project 2025, this is something that hasn't been reported, but a lot of it is like debates internally. There's one policy that's outlined about a child tax credit and then another policy that's outlined about a child tax credit. People said none of this is even being facilitated. And that, because Project 2025 has become such a lightning rod, the ball has not moved further down the field on that question. The Trump campaign sort of haphazardly tried to put out its own policy agenda. Trump still is Trump, though, and goes back and forth. And this is probably the central problem of the new right that we keep coming back to time and again, is that he doesn't have a cohesive ideology. And in a way, he's more similar to a lot of average Americans.
Ezra floated an idea, I think after this in the podcast, that I hadn't contemplated before. The assumption in liberal circles is like Trump is going to be worse this time because he's going to have his shit together, basically. And so like all the craziest stuff that he wanted to do last time, but he couldn't really get his act together to do. This time, they got their ducks in a row. They've got their loyalists. They're going to, fire the deep state. They're going to install the Trump loyalists. And if there was to be a January 6th style event this time around, they would have the, the people at the State Department and wherever to actually seize the ballot boxes, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, but there is an alternative possibility, which is that it's actually more chaotic and less competent. Yeah. Because now you have all of these different factions that have developed that are fighting for control of what the Trump agenda is going to be. And I was curious if you could elaborate more on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't want to rule out either possibility, but I also think, and we talked about this a little bit, there are not enough people in the world, let alone sort of professional Republican political spaces, to staff an agenda like what a sort of extreme Trump agenda would look like, or I should even say like an extreme conservative agenda.
Yeah.
Because you need to fill the so-called like deep state spaces. Not only do you need to like fire everybody that's in them now, you then need to bring new people in to at least staff some of them. And the Trump administration we saw last time, this was part of Project 2025 too, they just had a really hard time, getting certain things past the bureaucracy, which as a conservative I look at and I'm like, that tells you the president is not ultimately in charge. Like that's a legitimate problem. And you've seen it even play out, Ryan and I have talked about this before, in ways that really are shocking from the left. If you have a left policy that the EPA doesn't want to actually fulfill because you have a bunch of careers who have been there and have been through the revolving door with special interests and all of that stuff, I think that's a legitimate problem. But that aside, if you can't at least replace some of those people, you can't really do much because you're just going to be hampered. Now, on the other hand, at the executive level, that's a huge question because Donald Trump learned a big lesson from his side with Mike Pence. And he thinks that J.D. Vance will not be a Mike Pence if we have another January 6th. And that was part of like creating these new loyalty litmus tests. And I don't know that we have the answer to that question, actually, because politicians are ultimately self-interested creatures. And if J.D. Vance is sort of reading the tea leaves on a potential January 6th, I don't know. I think you have to stress test. And on the other hand, though, at the executive level, Donald Trump will not make the mistake, as he sees it, of putting more Mike Pences around him. But there aren't that many people in professional Republican spaces that are hardcore MAGA, and they might be publicly, but privately, they don't want to be roped into those situations because they still don't know what happens after Trump.
Right, which sort of illuminates the fact that there are two types of true believers. Mike Pence was a true believer in a certain way, but not a true believer when it came down to it, right? So he was a true believer. And I mean, all the policies, like he was on board.
Yep.
He was the one in the meeting when they said, tell us something great about Donald Trump. He's the first, he's the most, he's the best president. He's so amazing.
He even
I'm on board, you know.
He hung in there with him on the election stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
Until January 6th.
He did.
He wouldn't do he wouldn't do the Claremont Institute John Eastman plan. But he hung in there until January 6th.
He was willing to give credence to like, oh, maybe these lawsuits, you know, maybe this was rigged. And so I mean, he got to his breaking point. So in Trump's view, he ends up not being a true believer. He's hoping J.D. Vance, like I think the critical threshold for J.D. isn't about his policy views, of which Trump seems relatively uninterested. It's his belief that when it came down to January 6th, he would do what Mike Pence was unwilling to do. So there's two types of true believers. There's like the people who would be like, yeah, I believe in a 10% tariff across the board, and I'm willing to make waves and piss people off and like, you know, use my agency's powers to effectuate that outcome.
Right.
And that's one type of true believer. And then there's the type of true believer that will say, yes, sir, I will throw the country into a constitutional crisis based on literally nothing and, you know, be okay with this violence at the Capitol and whatever. And I think it's harder to vet for that second type of true believer, because I think he probably believed that Mike Pence was that second type of true believer right up until that day. I mean, he was reportedly pressuring him all the way up and still thinking. You know, he said, I think at his, you know, infamous speech, like, well, let's hope Mike Pence does the right thing. So he still thought up until that moment that Mike Pence potentially was that type of just, you know, throw out the Constitution and do whatever I tell you to, true believer.
Well, and what's interesting about J.D. Vance, and this is the conversation, you guys have talked to him, so you've picked up on this, I'm sure, but he is a sincere post-liberal. I think one of the mistakes the left makes about J.D. Vance is that he's just pro-Trump for opportunistic purposes, but he really, when he converted to Catholicism, he has like a multi-thousand-word essay on this in the Catholic publication, The Lamp. It's a very fully fleshed out, sincere post-liberal worldview. And what post-liberal in that context means is that sometimes you sort of, this is a simplification, of course, but sometimes the Constitution has limits, right? Sometimes there are sort of illiberal ends that are just. And so that is a sincerely held belief that J.D. Vance has. Now, how that pertains to the Constitution in any sort of different context is an open question, but it does tell you that he comes from the sort of Patrick Deneen orbit where the Constitution isn't the sort of sacred, almost like holy text that a lot of the conservative movement thought that it was, that there are these arguments that can be made that it can sort of be stretched in emergency circumstances, et cetera. So that could mean there's a difference on January 6th between Mike Pence or J.D. Vance, but it also couldn't. So it's like fascinating question.
The way you articulated it, I think, is not particularly different from how I view J.D. Vance. I think his embrace of Trump is in that, like, it's very convenient for him that at the moment when he wants to run for senator and has national political ambitions, suddenly he's, you know, a big Trump fan. I think that's opportunistic because of he does believe, you put this more diplomatically, but in some sense he believes like the ends justify the means. And if the means are cozying up to this guy that I once said might be America's Hitler, then I'll do it. If the means are like, you know, lying about Haitians eating pets in a town that I represent, I'll do that. If the means are potentially like, you know, doing what Mike Pence wouldn't do on January 6th, if it's going to help me accomplish the ends that I genuinely believe are better, superior, et cetera, yeah, I'll do that too. And so that's, so in that sense, I think he's a true believer about the ideological view that he holds. Do I think he's a true believer in all the, like, you know, how much he loves Trump now and thinks Trump's so great, et cetera, et cetera? No, because it was very politically convenient the way that all went down. But do I think that he views Trump as the
tool, the
nearest vessel for his own ideological ambitions? Yes, I believe that.
And that was the critical distinction. I mean, I think that's what happened to a lot of people on the right. Especially after Michael Anton, he was anonymous at the time, but wrote the Flight 93 election. I think this was October of 2016. That was the beginning of this conversion for a lot of sort of the intellectual conservative world who said, we are in illiberal times, so we can't use liberalism as the tool to return to, and this is like classical liberalism, so small L, we can't use liberal means to get back to this like classical liberal utopia that